Welcome to Reconciliation Roundtable. I am Mark Beckwith, the host. I am the retired bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Newark, the author of Seeing the Unseen Beyond Prejudices, Paradigms, and Party Lines. And with me today is Curtis Chang, who is the founder of Consulting Within Reach, a consulting professor at Duke Divinity School, a faculty appointment at American University and the Graduate School of International Service. He has been a pastor at the River Church community in San Jose, California, where he lives. He is the author of Anxiety, Opportunity, How Worry is the Doorway to Your Best Self, and with Nancy French, The After Party Toward Better Christian Politics, which is sort of how we came to be an acquaintance with one another. He is also the host of Good Faith podcast. So Curtis has a wide reach, a deep depth of faith and insight. And welcome, Curtis. Welcome to this time together.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me, Mark.
You have been a pastor. You write and speak a lot about religion and faith. How did that journey start? What has supported it and what gets in the way?
I think one way to describe a very personal narrative in all of this is that I grew up in the evangelical subculture, came to faith through a evangelical free church in the Midwest and Chicagoland area. The faith that I grew up in was very personal, very pietistic, very much about, Jesus as your individual Lord and Savior for your personal life. And yet, as much as that was the faith that I came to and was nurtured in, and by the way, I was the first person in my family to become Christian, so I was a true convert. I did not grow up in a Christian home. So I was having this sort of very individualistic, private faith on one part of my life. And then another part of my life, as just somebody growing up as a student in our educational system, I gravitated very much to the world of politics, of history, and was just fascinated. And yet I thought that this whole interest in the broader world had nothing to do really with my Christian faith. And it really wasn't until college that I became to see that this division between my faith and how I make sense of the broader world through history, politics, economics, and so forth, actually there was meant to be integrated. Since then, it's been sort of working that out, really, of how to integrate a deep, meaningful, genuine, personal faith with Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior, with also this proclamation that Jesus makes, which is that he is the Lord of the Lords, the King of the Kings, that actually has ramifications for how we make sense and navigate the broader world. And so, the career arc that I've followed that you've narrated could seem like somebody who's being all over the place in terms of their vocation. And then there may be some truth to that. I don't know. But I'd narrate it as somebody that is going back and forth between the worlds of faith. So I've been a pastor, I've served on the faculty of Divinity School, Duke, and senior fellow at Fuller, and then also deeply engaged with the world of secular institutions and politics and government through my consulting practice. And really the last 5-6 years of my career, starting this organization called Redeeming Babel, which is the host for the Good Faith podcast and is the home of the After Party project, is a sense of calling really to integrate these two realms even more, to help Christians navigate, make sense of the broader world of culture, society, and especially politics these days. And so that's what I do on my podcast with Good Faith Podcast every week. I have guests like David French and Russell Moore and Tim Alberta and so forth to talk about how we make sense of the world. And then the After Party project that I founded and co-led with David French and Russell Moore on this moment when the relationship between faith and politics is so fraught and in some ways dysfunctional and unfaithful to, I think, the message of Jesus himself. This project was really trying to address that. So that's a kind of a brief way to answer your question, Mark.
Thank you. And you've written that we need, and I think the we refers to particularly the Evangelical Church, to heal the root of spiritual dysfunction, that people are formed in loss avoidance and are poorly equipped to tolerate anxiety. Say a little bit more about that and how we might best address, how you propose to address that, to heal that.
Yeah, so this gets to the book that I wrote before the After Party project called The Anxiety Opportunity. And I was actually very deliberate, knowing that we probably were going to need to do some work in the realm of politics, that before I did that, I wanted to write a book and produce some material and resources to deal with anxiety. And you might think, why would you want to tackle the spiritual framework of anxiety before you tackle something on politics? And the answer is because you can't really understand what's going on in politics right now, broadly speaking, but especially among evangelicals, if you don't understand anxiety, that our politics are soaked with anxiety. They're being motivated by anxiety. They're getting deformed by anxiety. And so in many ways, our anxiety has to be addressed. I would say in many ways before, or at least parallel to, how we address our deformed politics. And the way that they're connected is that anxiety is fundamentally, I believe, a natural human experience that we have in the face of loss. It's not a sin. It's not a sign of lack of faith. It's just the way human beings are built to respond to the face of loss, that Jesus in himself even experienced anxiety in the face of impending loss. You look at passages about Gethsemane and so forth. The problem with anxiety is not that we experience anxiety, it's that we think we shouldn't experience anxiety. That's really what leads us to anxiety disorders, which is not the same thing as anxiety. And so anxiety disorder is basically when we cannot tolerate, when we cannot hold the experience of anxiety. And why this is important, why this leads to politics, is because anxiety equals loss, right? If we're going to experience loss, we're going to experience anxiety. And so when we say that we cannot tolerate, that we shouldn't feel anxiety, that we should make that feeling go away, we're really saying we can't experience loss. We shouldn't have to endure that. And that's the connection point to politics, because in politics, a healthy politics requires us to actually be able to endure loss. Because in politics, you lose. You don't always win. You don't always get your way. And so if you are saying, I can't experience anxiety, you're also saying I can't experience loss, which means I can't actually engage in politics the way that we're designed to tolerate loss, where we can tolerate other people winning, knowing that no loss is final. And so that's the connection point, is that I think a lot of Christians who are anxious about the world, about what the world might be doing to their faith or their faith communities or their faith values, have been conditioned to not be able to just handle loss, to handle loss of even good things, and so are looking to politics to save them from loss, in some ways to deal with their anxiety. And I think that's really what is a big spiritual driver for a lot of the dysfunctions in how Christians approach politics, that we're looking for politics to give us something that politics actually never was designed to and cannot give, which is to save us from loss. For Christians, that will not happen through human politics. That only happens from our faith in how God has promised to restore us from all loss in the end.
It's often thought that the opposite of faith is doubt. I think it's been said, and I certainly subscribe to this, and I'm hearing that you may as well, that the opposite of faith is certainty. And there's so much politics today that's framed in certainty that minimizes anxiety and just masks over some deeper issues that need to be addressed and need to be focused on. I appreciate the work that you've done to help unpack that anxiety, invite people into it. The movement that I'm so much a part of, Braver Angels, does the same kind of thing, invites people to deal with the issues that are before us, not to pull one side to the other, but to help us see if we can find some common ground. We have to work through some things to get to it. This podcast is called Reconciliation Roundtable. You mentioned that you came into the Christian community through the Evangelical Church. I am an Episcopalian, been Episcopalian most of my life. I flirted with Quakerism at one point, with Buddhism at another point. So I'm on the progressive end and the evangelical end. Those are two parts of the Christian family that rarely have contact with one another. How do you see a reconciliation possible? How can we, those of us who claim ourselves as Christians, who follow Jesus, but in very different ways, how can we work together in a more effective way?
Well, by the way, they do come together. They come together in the Chang family because I married a lifelong Episcopalian who came to faith in an Episcopal church in Texas and introduced me to the glories of the Book of Common Prayer. And so it's certainly possible because that describes my marriage. Look, I don't actually think the big divides in the Christian church right now are between what you might call denominational lines. I actually think denominations are less and less important in how the majority of Christians make sense and structure their life of faith. It's partisan politics. That's really the dividing line that cuts across many actual specific churches, church denominations, communities, and so forth. And it is the thing that pastors are struggling with, is how to hold together even their congregations. It's one of the leading stress points for many pastors, is how do I lead a church in which political partisan divisions threaten it? Why election seasons is always so fraught, at least in these last 3 election cycles for pastors. The answer to your question can sound like a Sunday school answer. It is at one point simple and another point incredibly challenging, complex, which is Jesus. I mean, Jesus is the center of our faith, the author and perfecter of our faith. And so that's why I wrote the book, The After Party, why we started the project, The After Party course, all the other resources, including a worship album that we created, was to call Christians to recenter our politics, not in partisan identity or a particular human partisan leader, but in Jesus. And that to recapture that Jesus had actually a great deal to say about politics, but not in the way that we have defined and want, in some ways, want to make Jesus in the image of our own politics. When I say the word politics, I think most people immediately think about red or blue, or a set of policies, or which candidate, or what should I vote, or vote against, or should oppose. And certainly politics is absolutely about all of that, which I would all characterize as the what of politics, the what of party, policy, ideology, candidates, and so forth. The what matters, it is part of politics, but we forget that politics is as much about what I'm calling the how of politics. How do we hold our positions? How certain are we that we're right? How do we relate with people who are different than us, who hold different views? How do we retain a sense of hope when our side hasn't won or it seems to be losing? How do we relate when our side is winning, right? These are all how questions. They're every bit about politics. Politics is just how do we live together in a common life? That's what the polis is. That's where the word politics comes from. How do we live together as a community, even when we differ on the what? And this is why I think your work with Braver Angels is so congruent with the After Party, because we do need to figure that out. And the fortunate thing is that we don't need to figure it out by ourselves, because if you look at Jesus' teaching on politics, yes, there are some ways in which you can draw a line from Jesus' teaching, say on the Sermon on the Mount, to a particular what of politics. But I really believe the line from Jesus to politics is actually much clearer, and in some ways even more challenging on the how of politics than when Jesus says, you must love your enemies. You must speak the truth. You must not call your opponents names. Right? These are all things that are found in the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
These are all how issues that we need to actually submit ourselves to Jesus, in addition to making some claims about the what of politics.
Sure. You've also written that preserving democracy must have a spiritual component to it. Presumably, and there are lots of spiritual expressions, Christianity being the one that we know the best and we are formed by. But what does the spiritual component to democracy look like?
Well, so one thing I want to really make clear is that Christianity, and this may be obvious, but it just bears saying, Christianity is not the same thing as democracy, and Christianity does not depend on democracy. There are many Christians in the world and throughout history who have lived, the majority of Christians in history have lived in a non-democratic society, and Christianity was born and birthed in a non-democratic society. Democracy, I would say modern, what we call modern liberal, lowercase l, liberal democracy, the kind that has prevailed in America for hundreds of years, that is actually, in many ways, a product of Christianity, a product of Christian values expressed in a public life, right? And because at the heart of democracy is really two notions that Christianity birthed into the world, or Judeo-Christianity birthed into the world. One is that human beings are made in the image of God and therefore have an inherent dignity and worth and value. And so much of what democracy is about is protecting the inherent dignity of the individual and individual communities, right? So that they can have this inherent worth and value. And then the other is that human beings are also fallen, that we are prone to the will to power, as Nietzsche would say. And therefore, because Christianity, very sober-eyed about that, we're prone to wanting to resort to force, power, and even violence to get our way. That we need to set up a government which puts some checks and balances on that worst angels, the worst angels of ourselves. And that's really where democracy is set up to have these kinds of checks and balances. And that really was a Christian contribution. If you trace the intellectual history of democracy, Locke, Grotius, all these key thinkers, they were trying to solve a Christian problem, which is that we were killing each other. I mean, you talk about denominational differences, right? We Catholics and Protestants, in Europe, we were killing each other over our religious differences. And so really democracy was invented by many, many Christians, not only Christians, but many, many Christians, to try to solve that problem. I think it's important to recognize that Christian democracy, while not the same thing, have this intimate relationship that one birthed another. Christians birthed democracy in many ways to solve a problem that we also had brought into the world, namely religious violence and intolerance. So this is why I think it's important to articulate the spiritual dimensions of democracy. Things like ability to tolerate loss, ability to still love our enemies, to love our neighbors, to hold some humility about how right we are. And those are all actually virtues that I believe any thriving democracy needs to have.
There are components in the Christian witness, notably the New Apostolic Reformation that our colleague Matthew Taylor has written about and talks about and is lifted up, which proposes that Christianity be dominant in the world and that there are 7 mountains that they aspire to have dominion over: politics, religion, government, family, education, entertainment, and I can't remember what the other one was. Your connection or your awareness or response to New Apostolic Reformation is something that we should be paying more attention to. What's your response?
Well, my response is that the New Apostolic Reformation represents a persistent temptation for Christians throughout the ages, which is to seize power to enforce our own way and to coerce others to adopt our defined way. And that is a persistent tension going back to Christendom itself. And it's a persistent temptation, honestly, that goes back to Christ himself. The first narrated temptation that Jesus faced was from Satan himself. And Luke's version, I think, is the one I like the best, which describes Satan taking Jesus to the mountains. You talk about these 7 mountains, to the mountains and saying, look at all the dominions of the world.
Right.
Probably including all 7 that the New Apostolic Reformation lists. And saying, all of this could be yours if you just bow down to me. The forces of power that I seem to command and control in the world. Jesus refuses to do this. If you resist that temptation, knowing that the way to how Christians were to engage in the world and to spread the gospel was not through power and coercion and force, but ultimately through sacrifice, through love, through persuasion, that would all be represented in the cross. So the cross is a refutation against this impulse to seize worldly power to have our own way. And Jesus himself resisted that temptation that Satan put before him, and he lived and died as a sort of a life of fidelity to the belief that God's ways are not man's ways or Satan's ways. And the resurrection, of course, is the vindication of that choice. And so, the New Apostolic Reformation is simply the last in a long line of temptations that we take shortcuts to the kingdom, not through the path of Jesus, which is about love of neighbor, love of enemy, of enduring suffering versus trying to inflict suffering on others. So I think it's a form of heresy that does need to be called out and resisted. And so And that's really what the work of the after party is trying to do, is to try to help Christians understand that the way of Jesus is not the way of this seeking of power.
A feature in my book is the introduction, which my spiritual director provided to me, of the mandorla. It's the Italian word for almond. It's the shape that's created when two circles intersect. And there's medieval art of heaven and earth intersecting. It's not the halo, it's the mandorla. And the icon that I pray before every morning has Jesus in the mandorla pulling people out of hell. It's a place of transformation. It's a place of risk. And increasingly, it seems to me that the intersecting circles are red and blue. And you can't force people into the mandorla. And people on opposite sides who are taking refuge in the far reaches of their respective circles continually invite people into the comfort, the certainty, the stability, the security of their circle and away from the mandorla. What I'm hearing you say is, let's invite people into that space and look at the texts and the witness of Jesus and others who say, oh, we can live together.
Yeah, I love that image. I've never heard that concept of the mandorla, but that's a beautiful image. And I think it actually describes the space that Jesus created himself for his first disciples. One of the things that people don't realize is how deliberately Jesus himself stepped into the partisan divides and harsh conflicts and polarization of his day. You know, when Jesus sort of launched his public career, he did so in a first century Israel society that was riven with political conflict, in particular between two sides, the red and blue of his day, which was defined by how are you going to relate to the Roman Empire, right? Because the Roman Empire had colonized Israel. First century Jews were really deeply divided on, do you collaborate with the Roman Empire or do you resist and oppose and fight against the Roman Empire? And the two opposite ends of these differing sort of stances really would be characterized by the tax collectors and the zealots. So the tax collectors were people who had chosen to collaborate, to cooperate with Rome. They were collecting taxes for Rome, as a matter of fact. And on the other side, the ones who opposed Rome, Jewish nationalists, if you will, were the zealots, a movement really actually who often practiced and called for violence against the collaborators, against the tax collectors. So zealots and tax collectors were the red and blue, but even worse, they were actually killing each other actively. Jesus, when he was a child, grew up in Galilee, and in 4 BC Galilee, when Jesus probably was just a child growing up, there was a violent zealot uprising led by Judas of Galilee, not Judas the disciple, Judas of Galilee, that rose up and killed tax collectors, burned the houses of tax collectors, and so forth. And then in turn, the Roman Empire came and brutally crushed that zealot revolution in order to protect the tax collectors. Okay, so that's the setup.
Yeah.
What people realize is that when Jesus called his first 12 disciples, his first most intimate mandorla, the 12 disciples as listed in Matthew 11, almost all of them are listed by their classic Jewish way of identifying somebody, son of so-and-so. There's two that are identified differently, Matthew and Simon. Simon is identified as Simon the Zealot. Matthew is identified as Matthew the tax collector. Right? So in Jesus's own first intimate circle that he created deliberately, he deliberately chose one member from the most extreme polarized parties in his day. You know, the tax collector and the zealot were part of his 12. Imagine that hostility and tension that was in his first gathering when he brought all 12 of them together. Like, oh my gosh, what are we part of here? He's there, like, and Simon's there, Matthew's there. What? That's not an accident. That's not a throwaway detail. I think it's a very deliberate act of Jesus to communicate, this is what my kingdom is going to be like. It is not going to be defined by the political conflicts and partisan divisions that define the politics of our day. It's going to be about a kingdom that transcends this, that overcomes these divisions. And I think this selection of Simon and Matthew to be part of his inner circle is a sign of that.
Which speaks to the hope of Jesus and speaks to the hope of the faith. And where, as you go around the country and speak and hear, where do you find hope? Where is the hope emerging for you?
Well, ultimately, the hope does not come ultimately from any certainly news event or anything I've seen in the world happening. There are some signs of hope that I'll talk about, but of course, as Christians, our ultimate hope is in Jesus, that Jesus has overcome the world in his life, death, and resurrection, and that he will come to complete and fully establish his kingdom when he comes to return to this world. And those are the anchoring events for Christian hope. Even amidst the turmoil and the legitimate concerns and fears we have in the immediate short-term future, that in the long term, we know how the story ends, that Jesus will return to fully restore all things, to restore and fix what is broken now. So that's my ultimate hope. I do find signs that point to that hope when I meet Christians who are really anchored in that hope. I've come this last several months, I've done more traveling than I ever have before in my life to promote the after party. And in community after community, when I meet Christians who are sometimes living in very deeply divided, or they're the one purple church in a deep sea of red or blue, mostly it's usually red in the churches that I've been visiting, just their sense of encouragement, of faithfulness, their deep desire to not let partisan politics shape their reality. It's deeply encouraging to see that. And I see it all over. So the after party we estimate has been experienced by over 200,000 individuals. And I know that's a very large number. It's a drop in the bucket to, of course, the number of Christians out there in the world who need to hear that. But it's a mustard seed of hope that we really believe and hope that God will continue to multiply.
A mustard seed and a leverage, it would seem to me, because I'm hearing from people, feeling in myself, that we need to anchor ourselves in the traditions that we find our solace and comfort and guidance in. But at the same time, we need to bring our faith out into the world and build relationships, especially across difference, and especially with people that we don't want to build relationships with. Now, some people were going to say, no, it's just not, I can't do it. But we are impelled as followers of Jesus and watching his witness that he was always bringing people together. That's something that we need to do, and hope and life and mercy emerge out of that.
Yeah. And we need signs. We need signs of hope that point to that reality. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in doing in this next years of the Trump administration 2.0 is I'm really interested in hearing about local stories where people, especially Christians, have come together, maybe especially come together across party lines, not to agree on the same thing. This is very much like what you talk about in Braver Angels, but to work together to solve some local problem that's actually in their community, in their neighborhood. I think we need more stories of that. We're so inundated with stories at the national level, which immediately get defined and scripted out as a conflict of something, right? Because that's the narrative that sort of sells news, and I understand that. But I think we need to counter, or at least leaven, the stories that we are consuming with stories in our local neighborhood, where it's not a red versus blue fight, but rather just people, neighbors, coming together to solve some problem about their schools, their parks, their welcoming the stranger, dealing with people of need, serving their youth. And I'm really on the hunt for those kinds of stories, because I think we as Christians are really going to need to reground in the second greatest commandment, which is to love our neighbor as ourselves. The command to love our neighbor as ourselves presupposes that we are in a neighborhood, right? That's what it means to have a neighbor. And so to love your neighbor is inextricably tied with love your neighborhood. And I think the Christian vision is to love our neighborhood with our neighbors, even including our neighbors who may think differently from us on some national issue, but that we can together love our neighborhood together and in the process learn to love each other. And so that's what I'm hoping to hear more stories of. And so, if anybody listening to this has a story like that and they want to share that with me, you can reach out to me. You can just go to my site through the after party because I'd love to hear those stories.
Yeah. And I think it's also giving us an opportunity to reintroduce mission. So much of mission in the Western church was bringing God to places where God is not. And if you think about the arrogance of that, when in fact mission is joining where God is already working. And we are invited to join where God is working, and there's not a square inch of ground on the face of the earth where God is not at work, and inviting us to join God in that redeeming, healing, witnessing to hope. Curtis, thank you. Thank you for what you are doing, what you are saying, what you are writing, lifting up the Christian faith. How can people follow you, read you, hear you?
Well, one easy way is if you want to listen into hopefully a really helpful conversation every week on how faith relates to the wider world, you can tune into the Good Faith podcast. I have regular guests with just really smart, thoughtful, faith-filled leaders like David French and Russell Moore. I talked about Pete Wehner, N.T. Wright, Andy Crouch, Andrew Peterson, just to name some folks that we have on our podcast every week. Good Faith podcast. And then if you're interested in our work on politics in the ways that I've talked about, you can check out the book, The After Party, or check out the course that we created if you are in a part of a church community that is a part of a small group or a Sunday school. And you can go to find that at after-party.org, after-party.org, and check out the course. Those are some of the most accessible ways.
Great. Well, thank you for this time together and for participating in Reconciliation Roundtable. I'm Mark Beckwith, retired bishop of the Diocese of Newark and the Episcopal Church and author of Seeing the Unseen Beyond Prejudices, Paradigms, and Party Lines. Thank you for listening to this episode of Reconciliation Roundtable. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform and visit markbeckwith.net to stay up to date with new episodes, blog content, and other news. Please, if you could, rate and review this podcast on iTunes. It helps new listeners to find us.